And without further ado, I might introduce our keynote speaker, Kingsley Aikins, who has a unique and progressive take on how Northern Ireland might network internationally to thrive through the Brexit crisis. Thank you very much.
Thanks, boys.
Kingsley.
Thank you, Stevens. So thank you, Stevens, and thank you, Davy, for the kind invitation to come up here today. My name is Kingsley Aikins, and I have an organization called the Networking Institute, so I'm passionate about networking. I'm a bit nervous here today because this is an awesome site. It's an incredible confection that's been put here today. I just met some people that have heard me speak on this topic before, and as I stood there, I felt a bit like Professor Max Planck, who was the great German theoretical physicist who 100 years ago this week won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and he went to Oslo and picked it up. And when he went back, he decided to tour Germany. And every night for 50 nights, he held a town hall meeting to explain the latest developments in global physics, and he had a driver who used to sit in the back. And then one morning, the driver said to him, "You know, I've heard you give this speech so often. I think I could give the speech just as well as you could." And Max Planck had a sense of humor, so he said, "Tonight in Karlsruhe, you give the speech. I'll sit in the back of the hall." And so the driver got up and for 1 hour gave a magnificent speech on the latest developments in global theoretical physics. But then just at the end, somebody put their hand up and said, "Professor Planck, could I ask a question?" He asked a very detailed and complex question about theoretical physics. And the driver, without missing a beat, said, "You know what?" he said. "The answer to that question is so simple, even my driver could answer it, and he's sitting at the back of the hall." So the Stevens may get that request if things get difficult. We're living in the best of times. This is the most peaceful time in history. This is the wealthiest time in history. 2 billion people have been taken out of poverty globally in the last 25 years. We're living longer than ever before in history. 50% of the people in this room who reach the age of 60 will reach the age of 90. And the children who are born to us today, more than half of them will live to over 100. The best of times. But it's also, bizarrely, the worst of times. Gallup did a poll some time ago, and they discovered that 85% of people of the workforce in the world are disengaged at work. Only 10% really enjoy their work. How terrible is that? Edelman, the global communications company, every year at Davos announced the results of the Edelman Trust Survey. And this year at Davos, they announced that trust in 4 institutions, government, media, business, and non-profits, is at its lowest level in recorded history. So now we're looking at a skeptical, cynical, distrustful world out there, and we wonder why Brexit happened. And it's all about disruption. Technology and innovation are disrupting every customer-facing industry that we're involved in, whether it's the law, or financial services, or gambling, or tourism, or travel, or reading books. Technology is disrupting. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity are driving things. And we're struggling, all of us, with this complexity. I listened to a speech the other day by the head of Mercedes-Benz, and he said, "Our future competition will not be car companies because they won't exist. They'll be technology companies." He used an interesting line. He said, "Change is happening now faster than ever before in history and never will be as slow again." And when you think about it, the largest taxi company in the world, Uber, owns no taxis. The largest accommodation company in the world, Airbnb, owns no accommodation. The largest content provider on the web, Facebook, creates no content. The largest retailer in the world, Alibaba, has no stock. So these are the dramatic shifts and changes. So no matter what happens with Brexit, these are the things These are the dominant things which are going to impact on our lives and our kids' lives. My dad left school at 14, joined a company, and worked there till he was 77. Just a quick 63 years in one company. The escalator model of a career. You join, work, get promoted, work. That's all over. My kids coming out of school, college now, 15, 20 different jobs. So networking becomes really important. There's a wonderful man, an American called Harvey Coleman, who has a theory called the pie theory of career progress. And he says your career progress depends on his theory of PIE, pie. He said 10% of your career progress depends on how well you do your job. Surely that's ridiculous. Surely how well you do your job is 90%. He said no. He says to get on the ladder, you've got to be good. It's mandatory. Everybody's pretty good. He said, we're talking about going up the ladder. He said you get paid on performance. You get promoted on what other people think of your potential. Now it introduces this notion of other people. So he says the I and the E of pie are more important to your career progress. And I stands for your image, what people think of you. What's your reputation? What does somebody say about you when you're not in the room? That's 30%. Your image. Your image will impact on the trajectory of your career. But 60% of your career progress depends on E, which is exposure. Who's seen you in action? Who's got your back? Who's your sponsor? Do you bring problems or do you bring solutions? Have you got a personal brand? Are you known within your company? Are you known outside of your company? So this turns many things on its head, particularly what my parents told me when I left college. Work hard, keep your head down, and keep out of trouble. Probably the worst advice any student was ever given in history, because things have all changed. The great technology company Google, founded by two geniuses, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, Russian mathematicians, only hired STEM students, people who were superb at technology and science. You couldn't get in there unless you got PhDs and masters in STEM subjects. And 2 years ago, they did a study. What makes a leader in Google? And they discovered you needed 8 characteristics to be a leader in Google. And the 8th and least important, they discovered, was technical ability. All the other talents you need were about listening, coaching, being part of a team, collaborating, helping others, setting out visions, connecting. All these soft skills. Last year I spent a day teaching in the National University of Singapore. The brightest kids in Asia fight to get into this institution. They've been foie gras education by their parents, stuffed into them. They're brilliant. They can play violin underwater. They're incredible. They come out of this university, the smartest kids in Asia, bright, deductive, and analytical, and completely crap at purpose, meaning, empathy, relationships, and networking. So why is networking so important? And what's the problems with networking? Well, here's one problem. Everybody hates it. It conjures up images of sleazy, slimy individuals late at night flicking out business cards in a bar. It's not taught at school or college. It's not a KPI. You're not assessed. You're not rewarded or compensated on it. But everybody says it's really important. Now, what is it? Well, as Stephen said, it's long-term hearts and minds relationships. But networking is about giving, not getting. Lots of people think networking is what I can get for myself. I've got a problem. I want a job. I want to make some sales. So I'm going to go networking. I'm actually saying the exact opposite. Networking is what I can do for other people. How can I put my network at the disposal of other people? And networking is interesting because all the research shows that people who have strong and diverse networks live longer. I like that one. Are stronger mentally and physically, earn more money, and are happier. And although it's not the topic of discussion today, I believe the greatest crisis facing the Western world is not ISIS or climate change or even Brexit. It's loneliness. And networking is the antidote to loneliness. So we now live in a world where it took 1,000 years to get a population of 1 billion. We will now have 1 billion more people on this earth in 12 years. And we're racing up to a population of about between 9 and 10 billion by 2050. And it's changed dramatically on this island. When I grew up in Dublin, essentially it was male, pale, and stale. It was not a very international, cosmopolitan city. I was telling one of the guys earlier that back then I went into a restaurant, I asked the waiter, what's the soup du jour? And he said, hang on, I'll ask the chef. And he goes in, and he comes out, and he says, it's soup of the day, right? Here's some interesting statistics. 12% of the United States were not born in the United States. In Ireland, it's 17%. In Dublin, it's 25%. But of the working age population of Dublin, it's 33%. So we now have, just as you have here, a very diverse network of people living in the city. But the question is, does your network reflect the diversity of your clients, of your customers? And all the McKinsey and the Bain research reports say that if your organization does not reflect the diversity of your customer base, you underperform. And that's one of the challenges that we have, to get away from the male, pale, and stale environment that we're in. So I was lucky enough to work for an organization called the Ireland Funds. And I'm a great fan of the notion that nobody started a large company. 21-year-old Steve Jobs and 27-year-old Steve Wozniak put some bits of a computer together and sold the first Apple computer from a garage. Walt Disney's first cartoon was made in a shed. Hewlett and Packard were in an outhouse. Amazon started in somebody's front room. Starbucks started in a garage. Nobody started a large company. There's people here who have kids who are going to be creating amazing things that we just don't know about. And I worked for one of them because I worked for an organization called the Ireland Funds, which is driven by two guys. One was an international rugby player for Ireland called Tony O'Reilly, who was an interest here with the Belfast Telegraph. And the other was Dan Rooney. Dan Rooney was the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a football team in the United States that's won 6 Super Bowls, just equaled by the Patriots. Dan Rooney's relatives and ancestors come from Northern Ireland. And they believed there was such a thing as an Irish empire, not built by military might or force of arms, but the fact that 10 million people left this island and went all over the world. And that we have a resource, we have a network for the island. And could we do what the Jewish people, particularly in the United States, did to support Israel? Could we do that for Ireland? Unproven. And so they ran a dinner, a black tie fundraising dinner, the Waldorf Astoria, the great and the good. The dinner was so unsuccessful. The only reason they had a second dinner a year later was to pay for the first dinner. And that's $750 million ago. Because we were modeled on the UJA, the United Jewish Appeal, what they did for Israel. Tony O'Reilly is a funny speaker, and on that opening night he said, our slogan was peace, culture, charity. He said, we're going to change it to look Irish, dress British, think Yiddish. If you could get those 3 things going, you might just have an interesting organization. And that's $750 million ago. And what it's become is a global network of affluence and influence to support activities in Ireland. There's another Irish American who's put over $350 million into Northern Ireland called Chuck Feeney. A working class, hard-scrabble guy who was bright enough to get to Cornell, went to the US Navy, got involved in Korea, demobbed, and set up duty-free store system in Southeast Asia and made a fortune. But he was a disciple of Andrew Carnegie, the great Scottish philanthropist. who really became one of the great givers of all time, who believed in the concept of give while you live. Andrew Carnegie famously said, "He who dies thus rich dies disgraced." And he became, if you like, the poster child for what's happening now in the philanthropy world. And Chuck Feeney was a disciple. And he believed that what he should do is, in his life, give his money away. By chance, he was sitting on a plane with the president of an Irish university who invited him to come visit. Chuck Feeney came in to visit with sandals, a plastic bag, and a cardigan. It's very easy to make quick assumptions about people. But here was an extraordinarily wealthy man who decided to invest in projects in Ireland. $350 million went into Northern Ireland in a whole range of different things. He's actually still alive. He's 86. He's in San Francisco. He's quite frail now. He lives in a rented apartment, and he wants to have paid out his last check on the morning that he passes away, because he says, "I want my check to the undertaker to bounce," which is kind of an interesting way to live your life. And what these people did was set up networks. Tony O'Reilly, who was a famous rugby player, scored 37 tries for the British and Irish Lions, 55, 59. He never invested in any country in the world where he hadn't played international rugby. And he used that network, which then, through the Ireland funds, we built that network in 39 cities and 13 countries around the world. I used to work for the IDA, the investment agency, and we used our Irish diaspora. We called them tipping agents. We knew they were people who could nudge a deal in our direction, because we knew life is a game of inches. So many decisions are 50-50. There's very little in it. And in an inward investment decision, if you win it, fantastic. If you come second, you get nothing. It's a winner takes all. Just like in sport, the margins can be very, very tight. And so we knew that through that diaspora network, globally, we could build our friends. And that's what we all have to do now. Small places, cities, regions, can be very nimble, like the bicycle courier in a traffic jam, if you like. I've just finished a piece of work for Denmark. Denmark have 250,000 well-educated Danes living outside of Denmark, and the government have now realized that's a resource. What were once lost actors can be national assets. We can use these people to support Denmark, and particularly Copenhagen. Because here's the crisis in Denmark. It's a crisis here. It's a crisis in Dublin. Talent. Finding, locating, and keeping talent. I heard from somebody the other day, they said the war for talent is over. Talent has won. And that's one of the great challenges, finding that talent. I spent all last week in Bosnia. 2 million Bosnians have left Bosnia. They're all over Europe, and they're extremely well educated and doing very, very well. So setting up these networks where you can reach out to what we call these diasporas, where actually you can look at your whole identity as much bigger than just small lines on a map, but of people who seep and slip from place to place. And if you know who they are, where they are, and what they're doing, they become this great national asset. Because we now live in a world where it's more important what you do than where you are. Because if you think about it, the people who emigrated here, from here over the years, when they were gone forever. My great-grandmother had 3 kids who left Sligo and went to Australia, and she never saw them again. The old American wake or Australian wake. But those days are over. People are here and there. They're living hyphenated lives. They're living transnational lives. They're engaged in one place. They live in another place. Your geography no longer dictates your identity. In the old days, if you lived in Southern California, that's who you were. But now you can live in Southern California but be very engaged in Belfast or London or Dublin or Madrid. And that's what's happening. Countries are tapping into these global networks, which were impossible before, but now technology and communications are making all these things possible. So I guess to sum up, that's my message. Networking is a really important thing for everybody to do on a personal basis, a really important to do on a company basis, but a really important thing to do for a city. I have an Apple iPhone down here. It's a great American product, but it's made in Shenzhen. In the early 90s, Shenzhen was a fishing village. Now it's the fastest growing city in the world. 10 million people. It exports a fully laden container every second. 25 million fully laden containers of products every year leaving that city, including my iPhone. Made in a factory called Foxconn with 1.2 million employees. What happens is that nothing lasts. Everything is transitory. And people and organizations and cities and countries come and they go. So our challenge is to use networking to keep on the right side of history. So thanks for listening. Have a really enjoyable lunch.